Most people watch the news, see the horror in the world, and think to themselves, I can't imagine how hard that is. And then they change the channel because it's too painful to watch. Advocates, on the other hand, step up every single day to sit right next to people feeling pain. They meet people on the worst days of their lives. Victim advocates have a really unique role in this world. My work is a constant love letter to victim advocates to sit with people in the depths of hell. For their bravery, I want to thank every victim advocate on this planet. And although my role as a trainer is to teach advocates skills and theories that they may use in the line of duty, I often find that the advocates teach me much more. This podcast is my nod to the brilliant people who've attended my workshops and opened my eyes to new ideas every day. I'm Dr. Kate Watson, and this is Advocate Insights. Okay, folks, welcome to Advocate Insights. I'm Dr. Kate Watson, and I'm flying solo today. I was having a couple of reflections on some recent trainings that I thought I might share. Some of you may know I train several thousand advocates every year. Some are child and family advocates, some are victim advocates, some work in hospital settings, some work in higher education, a lot of them work in the military. And maybe it's because I'm a therapist myself, but sometimes I'm teaching very basic advocacy skills. And I hear from a group of participants in my workshop, hey, Kate, this is all fine to learn about, but we're not therapists. And I hear that a lot, like, we're not therapists. This isn't for us to learn. And I find myself a bit confused. Maybe they're worried that I'm confusing the roles of advocate and therapist, but I'm not sure that I am. So let's talk about some of the similarities and differences. And I know you can't see it, but I'm looking at a Venn diagram. So two circles overlapping in the middle. And one of those circles says therapist and the other one says advocate. And the circle that says advocate includes things like knowledge about the criminal justice system, or if you are a military victim advocate, maybe it is the military justice system. If you are an advocate in higher education, maybe it's Title IX policy that you're knowledgeable about. That circle that says advocate includes things like offering accompaniment to court appearances or medical exams. Advocates are likely to be skilled at things like safety planning. The services that advocates offer are very often free to the user. So, for example, if you are an advocate who works at a university working with students, typically students can work with that advocate free of charge. Or if you work for a district attorney's office as an advocate, very often members of the community can work with you free of charge. Or if you are a member of the military, you can work with an advocate free of charge. Advocates also serve victims of violence or crime, as opposed to providing a wider or more general service that a therapist might provide. And working with an advocate is typically voluntary. It's hard for me to imagine a time when a person's been forced to work with an advocate. The circle that says therapist says something different. It has things here like a therapist is licensed to practice. A therapist typically has at least a master's degree, or in many cases, even a doctorate degree. A therapist offers diagnoses and treatment of specific disorders. A therapist is performing therapeutic interventions that have been tested. And you may have heard of some of these, things like cognitive behavioral therapy, or EMDR, or dialectical behavioral therapy. Advocates aren't performing those sorts of interventions. That is something that a therapist would do. A therapist can serve almost anyone who is willing and has access to care, as opposed to advocates who might work in a more narrow capacity. Like we said, they serve victims of violence or crime, whereas a therapist could work with just about anyone who wants to see a therapist and is able to see a therapist. Therapy or working with a therapist usually costs money, but it can be covered by insurance, or in some cases, it may be a free service if you're very lucky to be connected to like a university, for example. Very often, students can work with a counselor or a therapist on campus for at least a few sessions free of charge. But generally, this is something that does cost money. And working with a therapist can also at times be court mandated. So there may be some folks who feel pressured or coerced or even a bit forced to work with a therapist. But folks, there's also that area on a Venn diagram where the two circles overlap. And there's a lot in there. These would be the things that advocates and therapists have in common. And I'll just share with you, this is the stuff that I'm particularly fascinated by and interested in, and the stuff that I often teach about. So, whether you are an advocate or a therapist, very likely your work requires that you have a lot of empathy for people. Whether you are an advocate or a therapist, very likely your work requires that you provide support to people who are in need. Whether you are an advocate or a therapist, you may be involved in some sort of crisis intervention or response. I know, for example, a lot of advocates carry an on-call phone, and you may be called from an emergency room or a police station. And therapists sometimes do crisis response if they're on call, for example, for folks who may have a mental health crisis. Whether you are an advocate or a therapist, likely your work involves offering resources to people or educating them about resources that are available. Whether you are an advocate or a therapist, you are likely required to adhere to some kind of ethical code that considers things like confidentiality as quite important. And frankly, both an advocate and a therapist ought to have at least a basic understanding of trauma. And you might be thinking, well, wait a minute, therapists should have a really extensive understanding of trauma. Ideally, but the truth is some therapists get extensive training in trauma and others do not. So I would say the thing that a therapist and an advocate have in common is that both of them should have at least a minimal understanding of trauma, what it is, what some of the symptoms might look like. And then, of course, there are some therapists who call themselves trauma therapists. They get a lot more training. But your average therapist and your average advocate both ought to have a little understanding of trauma. So, folks, when I teach topics like post-traumatic growth or motivational interviewing or a basic understanding of trauma, I'm teaching a lot of the stuff in that middle space. I'm teaching how to provide support, how to help people in times of crisis, how to express empathy, and things like that. It's that place where therapist and advocate overlap that I most enjoy teaching. And folks, I hope that helps you navigate some of these murky waters and understand which hat you're wearing at which time. Because, I want you to feel confident that you know your role and you know what's expected of you. So let's keep this conversation going. I know a lot of people out there work as both a therapist and an advocate, and they tell me that they have to switch those hats from time to time. And so over the next few months, I think I'd like to reach out to some of them and see if we can get them on the show, even if it's not next month or the month after, but sometime soon, because I think this is an important topic. It's one that I hear about a lot when I'm standing up and I'm giving these workshops and I'm teaching things like empathy and compassion and active listening and how to support people, I long for the day when people no longer raise their hands and say, but I'm not a therapist. I agree that you may not be a therapist if you're in my training, although some therapists do attend my trainings. But I agree, if you are definitely an advocate and not trained as a therapist, it is important for you to know where that line is. But I don't think my workshops are crossing that line. Asking you to be a good listener is not me asking you to be a therapist. Asking you to understand trauma is not me asking you to be a therapist. And I'm going to keep working on some other ways to help that distinction become more clear. So thanks for joining me today. And to all of you out there, if you have any questions, comments, or feedback, please send me a message at kate@advocacyacademy.org. That's Kate, Kate, at Advocacy Academy, like it's all one word, .org. I'd be happy to hear from you there, but you can also find the Advocacy Academy on Instagram, Threads, and YouTube using the handle at AdvoCateW. So that's Advo, like ADVO, then my name, Kate W. So all together, it becomes Advocate W. And check us out next time when we explore more advocate insights.